Everyone, this week I wanted to take a look at two art movements that are leading up to World War I and then responding to it. And I want to take a look at their response as they're trying to come to terms with what's going on with the horrors in Europe. And one of the first modern total war where civilians, women, children, heavily populated areas are being targeted, and the whole idea is to try to bleed the other side to death. And artists are taking a look at some of these horrors and suggesting this is a severe problem. We need to really investigate where we're going and the direction of this modern world. I want to take a look at Expressionism, and this is an art movement that began in the German cities of Dresden and Munich. The movement began around 1910, so roughly about the time of Fauvism, roughly about the time of Cubism, roughly about the time of a couple other art movements that are happening, and lasted to roughly the 1920s. And so we're going to see it come from the beginning of the war and then after the war and how they're responding to it. The movement demonstrated the repressiveness of artistic institutions and sought to destroy contemporary art by looking at medieval art or African art. Again, this idea of primitivism, kind of loosely speaking, that's just the terminology, and linking these artistic ideals to contemporary realities. The group focused on the spirituality of art to find renewal for humankind. So finding these connections, but using art not necessarily to inspire and to direct and lead to revolts and extremism that we see with futurism, but trying to inspire change within the individual, right? Spirituality is an individual, and we need to examine these forces within ourselves, right? Kandinsky said this, and I think this is important for us to think about in terms of the evolving style of modern art. He suggests that realism is abstraction, and abstraction is realism, right? And it kind of picks up on the idea of Van Gogh, or it picks up on some of the ideas that we talked about with Fauvism, this idea that representing the real world with representational art, right, visual reality, doesn't necessarily get us closer to truth all the time. Sometimes moving away from that, representing the inner mind, inner thoughts, inner realities, gets us closer to realism or truth, right? So we need to kind of get away from this idea to a certain extent of expecting modern art to be realistic, because they're coming from a different angle. Realism is false. If you're taking a look at a realistic painting, yes, that might look realistic, but in the end, at the core, it's a counterfeit of reality, right? If you're taking a look at a bowl of fruit, a painting of a bowl of fruit from like the Baroque era, that's not reality. That's a representation of reality, so it's a counterfeit of reality. So they're trying to get us closer to actually feeling what something would feel like, or experiencing what something would be like to experience, right? So just something to think about, right? The style of Expressionism, it was to unite the rational with the irrational, the inner mind with the irrational emotional forces within us, and to try to find a connection rather than repressing the rational, but finding harmony between them. Art should not imitate nature, right? So it should not just be about representing realism. It should be about doing something more, right? Scientific knowledge is inadequate to understanding the complex questions of life. And so if we're just using science to answer who am I, why am I here, where am I going, it's going to leave a lot of room for, confusion. There's a lot of things that can't be answered by science, at least in their mindset. And so they're suggesting that we need to dig a little bit deeper and not just use our intellects or our science to come to understanding truth, right? Let's take a look at a couple of expressionists just to give you a sampling of what the movement is like. Kirchner thought of himself to be the founder and leader of the Expressionist movement, and like Picasso, he took great pains to deny the influence of other artists on his works. His works show an expressive use of colors and unrealistic forms and a lack of linear perspective. So other things that we've saw before in other art, they're going to flatten the image. There's going to be a lack of linear perspective, moving away from realistic forms, and just this expressive use of colors. And so in a lot of ways it's going to look similar to other works. In some ways looks very similar to what you would see with Fauvism, but it's taking that idea of expression to a next level, right? And again, this is happening in a different country, this is happening in a different region, but we have similar ideas, similar effects aesthetically. I want you to think about what's the difference between beautiful art and pretty art. Can art be beautiful without being pretty, right? Something to think about. I think this is a question that modern artists are thinking about. If it's pretty, yes, right? As we think about Renoir, the young woman sewing, he was about representing prettiness. But, right, he's using models to come in and to represent this newly emerging bourgeoisie class. But does that always mean that art that's not pretty is therefore not beautiful? And I think we need to be careful of falling into that trap as well. If it's not pretty, it's ugly. And maybe that's a limited understanding of art. Here we see with a woman sitting in a chair, we recognize the chair, right? We recognize the red around it and then the orange at the base. We recognize the brown that gives it the feet of the chair. We recognize the dress of the woman and the flowers in the background all coming together. A very simple color palette that we would see with Cézanne, right? Limiting color space. However, unlike Cézanne, these are much more brighter, much more vibrant, much more, extreme in that sense, unsettling perhaps. Cézanne's focuses much more on earth tones and realistic use of colors. These are much more expressive, right? So a similar kind of smaller palette, but different in terms of what colors are being used and the hues that are being employed. But what we also see is kind of the blocking of space, very similar to what we see with Cézanne. But what we don't see with Cézanne, right, is this idea of these kind of wild kind of marks that we see with the outline of the chair. It's not really keeping within the context of the red, right? So it kind of goes over. Some people would take a look at this and say, well, a 6-year-old could color better than this because they keep within the lines. But again, it's not just about representing something realistic. It's about capturing something different, something deeper. How do we feel on the inside? How do we express those ideas, right? A little bit of shading underneath the chair, right? We see kind of the shadow of the chair a little bit, but the blue face is definitely unsettling, but capturing the emotion of the person rather than the visual reality. We see some intense contrast of colors, similar to what we see with Van Gogh, with the complementary colors being used in order to convey kind of this extreme feel to it that makes it pop and makes it be a little unsettling. But again, similar movements that are happening in different areas, or at least similar ideas that are happening. We've talked about the Fauvism with Matisse and the portrait of Madame Matisse. Similar ideas are happening in Germany with Kirchner and the sitting woman, focusing on expressive use of colors rather than using shading and whatnot to convey the idea, and linear perspective to convey depth and realism. But there are some clear differences, right? With Matisse, this one is much closer to the object, where it's just kind of this 3/4 kind of close-up of the image. But what we see with Kirchner, we see a full body as she's seated in a chair, giving us a different kind of perspective, a different kind of angle to it. But similar use of thick brushstrokes of paint. So similar ideas, although they're different movements happening in different areas. This one is one of his more famous works. This is Kirchner's Street in Berlin, and here you see some women that are walking the streets surrounded by men in top hats. These are the very wealthy, representing this kind of wealth that's rising in the industries and in urban cities, and reflecting the values of them. So similar to what we see with maybe Caillebotte and the Paris Street Rainy Day, where the people are walking around in Paris on a rainy day to be seen, right? So representing the nightlife. Some people suggest that the women in this image are women of the night, which might connect it to Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon. But they're wearing feather boas. They're wearing kind of this elaborate dress. So this is about going out and being seen, celebrating this kind of rising merchant class. But Kirchner does it in a way that it's a little unsettling, right? Where Renoir is representing these this rising bourgeoisies in a very calm, happy, peaceful, wish I was there, having this kind of wonderful meal and enjoying conversation sort of way. Kirchner's unsettling use of angles, where it feels like the figures on the left side are falling to the left, the figures on the right side are falling to the right. The unusual angle of the building in the background gives it this unsettling feel, which this is more of a commentary on the problems of this type of society, right? And so a question to think about is, if you have problems with a given society, if you see, as an artist, you see that there are problems there, and you want to make a change, you want to make an impact as an artist, how do you go about it? How do you create awareness? Can you create change by focusing only on pretty things? Or is it going to take something being unsettling? Because people here, if all they're seeing are pretty things, they're going to say, hey, life is great, I'm wonderful, I deserve all of this. But if we start to see this, we start to say, you know what, this is unsettling. Why is it unsettling? What are the problems? We have to start digging deeper. And so I want us to think about, in terms of aesthetic representation, which form of art is going to stay with us and have more of an impact. Representing something like this, which is representing the poor, right? Having a social message. Or this, which is a little more jarring and unsettling. And so artists are thinking about being the avant-garde. How do we direct society? How do I make the biggest amount of change? And sometimes that comes through more visual radicalism on making it a little bit unsettling for the artist. And we definitely see that here with the self-portrait as a soldier, where he's in the foreground and he's missing, his hand has been amputated, and then the nude woman in the background contrasts that, which makes it suggest what's going on within this particular scene. It makes it feel unsettling. So the idea is to try to shock us out of our complacency and start thinking a little bit more critically about the world around us, so that we can create change, right? In a similar way to futurism, trying to inspire people to change, right? Futurism has a different aesthetic, has some different kind of objectives to it, but this is trying to create awareness so that we will be unsettled by the world around us, and so that we'll think about ways that we can change. Taking a look at one more expressionist, I want to take a look at Kandinsky. And I think he's probably, even though Kirchner says he's kind of the leader of the movement, I would say that Kandinsky is the one that's more known, more well-known, because he just goes so radical with his art that it leaves a lasting impression on all the art that comes after it. He studied economics and law in Moscow. His dissertation was on the legality of workers' wages. And so again, thinking about the changing dynamics, the socioeconomic conditions, definitely influenced by that, wants to bring awareness to it. In 1896, he decided to become an artist. His early works focused on knights and romantic riders, and kind of you see that on the bottom right-hand side. It kind of looks like a person riding a horse, right? Kind of moving forward, even though it's improvisation number 12. It's kind of this idea of this medieval knight, this chivalry, going back to the past, finding our roots within the past, and bringing these ideals and values to direct our modern world that feels corrupt and feels like it is descending into chaos, right? In 1910, he moved towards abstraction. This is what we see on the bottom as well, this abstraction, moving away from reality. His improvisations are subconscious images of his inner mind. So again, the idea of modern art is retreating more and more from the external world into the interiority space of the artist. He wanted to focus on the effects of colors. Much of his works focus on visual expressions of music. And I think this is one of his more famous ones. I think that you'll see this more in textbooks. This is improvisation number 28. Why is this one the more famous one? I don't really know. But it's one that's often taught at universities and make it into textbooks. But what we see here is painting sound. What does sound look like? Sound doesn't have a visual reference point. And so all you're painting are lines and colors, and that's really all you have. And so again, this is moving from Impressionism, which kind of starts this whole movement away from realism and visual reality, to just giving you the impressions of light and shading on a work, to post-impressionism, focusing on the inner emotions and thoughts and expressive qualities of the artist, their ideas, their thoughts, as we see with Van Gogh and Gauguin, moving towards Fauvism and what we see with Expressionism, moving further away from that visual reality to a point where we don't have any depth, we have no shading, we have no objects even being represented. All we have is emotion. And so in some ways, I mean, some people might see this and say, well, it's untrained. Anyone can, flick paint on a canvas. That might be true to some extent, but what isn't true is how well you can express those emotions with only having colors and lines to use, right? And one person's expression is going to be very different from Kandinsky's expression. And so I think what they're suggesting by this is if we look more at the interior self and figure out inner peace, inner harmony, within the chaos that surrounds us within this exterior world, maybe we can find less means to try to destroy one another, less means of going to war. And again, this is at the cusp of of World War I. And so they're thinking about, what feels as though society is leading to perhaps a disastrous end. Maybe we shouldn't embrace this. Maybe we need to think about more about what can save us, and what can save us in their mindset is finding out who we really are, finding out what connects us as human beings.